My brother was called useless, until the crash that made him a legend. They called him the idiot, a burden, a waste of space. No one cared to know his real name, Asa Whitmore. All they needed was a punchline to laugh at. He grew up in silence. He came home with blood on his shirt and only said, "I just fell." No one asked questions. No one stood up for him, except for his older brother, and even he once said something that would haunt him forever. Then came that one morning, the morning that changed everything. A school bus full of kids lost control and plunged into an icy lake, and only one person didn't hesitate. In those final moments, Asa made a choice that silenced the entire town, because sometimes the one you think is invisible is the only one brave enough to save the world. Asa Whitmore was 12 when the neighborhood got used to calling him the burden. No one used his real name except for Mom and Silas. Silas, his older brother by 4 years, was the only one who still saw Asa as a child, not a mistake. Asa didn't talk much. He couldn't keep up in class, couldn't hold eye contact for more than a few seconds. But he remembered everyone's birthday, even the lady who ran the corner grocery store. He drew bus route maps with old colored pencils, copied license plates, and time schedules with a precision that baffled adults. The other kids waited for him after school, not to play, but to jeer, to laugh, to treat him like a walking joke. One afternoon, Asa came home with blood on his forehead, a red streak smudged onto the collar of his sweater. Mom turned pale, but Asa just smiled, nodded like always, and said, "I just fell." Silas knew he was lying. He pulled Asa into the bathroom, cleaned the wound with warm water, taped on a Band-Aid. It was a routine repeated so many times it had become muscle memory. No one in the house said anything more. But each time before leaving the room, Silas would squeeze Asa's shoulder. Not because he was strong, but because if he ever broke down, Asa would have no one left. Asa's mother worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at the bakery and night shifts cleaning a veterinary clinic. She came home after both boys were already asleep and left before they ever opened their eyes. Dinner was reheated in the microwave. Her questions came out like habit. Was today okay? And all she got in return was a nod and the soft click of a closing door. But Silas didn't nod. He stared at her, then turned away. He had once been suspended from school for fighting the foster boys. They had called Asa a half-breed freak and tossed his backpack into the drainage ditch. Silas didn't think. He just reacted. Blood poured from his nose, his knuckles split wide from every punch. When he came home, Mom didn't yell. She just sighed, too tired to even ask what happened. That night in a kitchen heavy with silence, Silas finally broke. "I don't want to spend my whole life taking care of someone who'll never grow up." The words didn't hit Asa directly, but they pierced the air like a needle through cloth. Asa had been sitting at the corner of the table, folding paper quietly. His hands paused just for a second, but he didn't cry. He didn't run. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of rough cloth. He placed it gently in Silas's hand, eyes tilted in that soft, slanted way, without a hint of blame. Embroidered on it, in crooked, uneven stitches like him, were the words, "You are my home." Silas said nothing. But that night, he buried his face into his pillow and cried like he'd just learned what regret felt like. Asa had no friends in the neighborhood, but worse than loneliness was being treated like he didn't exist. Every time he walked past the small community basketball court, adults would go quiet for a few seconds, then resume their conversations as if he were nothing more than a passing breeze. Some even cracked jokes out loud. "Hey, look, it's Asa. Still not locked up yet. Guess even the asylum said no thanks." The laughter that followed was colder than a Michigan winter. Asa never responded. He just smiled. That odd, crooked smile like someone who'd learned how to smile from a misprinted book. One afternoon, Asa went missing for nearly 2 hours. The school called home. When they finally found him in the restroom of Building D, his shirt was damp and clinging to him, arms wrapped tightly around a small notebook. All he said was, "I fell asleep." But Silas knew Asa never slept without having lunch first. Silas snuck into the admin office, spent 3 days figuring out how to access the surveillance footage, and there it was. 3 older students pushing Asa into the restroom, locking the door, and walking away. Silas brought the footage to the principal. The man frowned and said, "Your brother, he's a little different. Maybe he misunderstood a joke." Silas slammed his hand on the desk. "Don't you see that wasn't a joke? That was imprisonment." All he got in return was a note in his record, Silas Whitmore, overreactive, needs emotional regulation. Asa never spoke of it again. He went back to drawing. Bus route maps covered his bedroom walls, each one numbered with drivers' names and the number of steps from the bus stop to each classroom. One night, Silas asked, "Why do you make all these maps?" Asa tilted his head and smiled. "In case one day the bus gets lost, I can help them find the way." Silas laughed, but his throat tightened right after. His little brother, a kid no one cared to look for if he ever went missing, spent his days drawing maps to help others find their way home. That morning was so cold, the pen in Asa's hand snapped in two as he tried to add one more route to his bus map. Snow blanketed the rooftops. The roads were coated in a thin layer of ice, barely visible but deadly slick. Mom had already left for work. Silas was still asleep, taking advantage of a delayed start at the high school. Asa held a small box of cookies wrapped in brown paper, a gift from Mr. Wilson, the driver of Bus Route 4. He was the only person outside Asa's family who ever said his name without a trace of pity. Yesterday was Mr. Wilson's birthday, and Asa had clumsily stitched a letter W into a napkin, tucked it inside the box. He was crossing the wooded shortcut near the bus stop when he heard it. The screech of tires, the shriek of brakes, and a high-pitched scream of metal scraping against stone. A yellow school bus spun across his line of sight, spinning, then crashing sideways into the icy slope by the lake. One side of its wheels now hung dangerously off the edge. Inside, screams, cries, a hiss of white smoke rising from beneath the engine. Asa didn't hesitate. He set the cookie box down in the snow and ran. There was no one else around. Just him, and the bus teetering like a breath away from falling. He climbed the back door ladder, arms trembling but gripping tight. One child pulled out, then another. One clung to his shoulder so hard it tore the sleeve of his jacket. The smoke thickened. The smell of gasoline grew stronger. A little girl sobbed, "I don't know the way out." Asa gasped for air, coughing violently, but still bent down, took her hand. "Don't be scared," he whispered. "Just follow my map." And then Asa turned back one more time, because one more child was still stuck at the very back of the bus. The last child was curled up in the window seat, hands covering her face, legs tangled in the seatbelt. The bus had tilted dangerously. Every movement brought a groan from the metal frame. Smoke filled the cabin like fog, and outside water had started to rise around the wheels. Asa looked around. No one else was left. The other children had escaped. The youngest was still sobbing outside, but a neighbor had scooped her up safely. He turned back. No screaming, no panic, just quiet, uneven steps toward the little girl. Wind rushed through the shattered window, tugging gently at Asa's messy hair. His face was smudged with soot and sweat, but his eyes were clear, as if nothing else existed but this child. He knelt down, fingers trembling as he tried to undo the buckle, every motion shaky but precise. "What's your name?" he asked softly like a breeze. "Becca," the girl whispered, eyes wide with tears. "Becca, you're going out now. I'll stay behind and make the path." The buckle popped. Asa lifted her his back, straining under the weight. Something sharp sliced through his pant leg, a jagged piece of metal. But he didn't stop. Water began pouring over the steps. A loud crack echoed the center. Axle snapped. Asa reached for the emergency hatch above them. He shoved it open and pushed Becca up. She thrashed in fear, but Asa gave one final push, and a waiting hand outside pulled her free, and then everything slowed down. Asa moved to follow, but his left leg was stuck. A steel rod had pierced through his pants, pinning him down. He yanked hard. Nothing. Outside voices were shouting. Phones were raised. Someone was filming, and in that video, a soaked, muddy-faced boy with a disability is still trying. Not screaming, not begging, just trying. He looked up one last time. Through the narrow hatch, morning light spilled across his face. And in that final moment before the water reached his shoulders, Asa smiled. A small, quiet smile, as if he knew he had done what he came to do. He couldn't swim, but he didn't hesitate. A second later, the bus went under. And Asa, the boy they called useless, was gone. But his story was only just beginning. The 47-second video appeared online just hours after the crash. A student had filmed it, hands trembling, but the footage was clear enough. Asa climbing into the bus, pulling kids through thick clouds of smoke, and then that final moment, pushing little Becca out the door and getting stuck inside. A smile, and then water. Dark. Total. The caption read, "I don't know his name, but he saved my sister." It didn't take long. The whole country knew his name now, Asa Whitmore. The press called him Angel Boy. TV stations replayed the clip on a loop, slowing each frame, as if they were just now realizing that this boy had existed in their town. The same town that had looked right through him. People who once ignored him now commented, "So sorry for your loss," dropping hearts on Asa's photo, as if he were some beautiful memory they never had the chance to hold on to. White ribbons lined every porch, every lamppost, even the school entrance, the same school where kids once laughed when Asa tripped walking past. A memorial stood on the edge of the schoolyard, a photo of Asa, a few words of remembrance and piles of flowers. But Silas never went. He couldn't stand to see them bow their heads. The same people who once threw shoes, who laughed when Asa fell, who locked him in a bathroom stall. The ones who said, "Poor Mrs. Whitmore, having a son like that." Silas stayed home. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He sat in Asa's room, now strangely tidy. Maps on the wall, colored pencil sketches, scrawled notes like Route 4 was 7 minutes late. Driver seemed sad today. And inside the small desk drawer, he found it. The handkerchief. The same old piece of cloth, edges fraying, threads loose at the corners. And stitched in uneven, childlike letters, "You are my home." Silas gripped it tightly. No tears. Just breaths, heavy shaking, and a hole in his chest where something had been taken. And for the first time he whispered, "I'm sorry, Asa." No one heard it, but maybe Asa did. The memorial was held on Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after the crash. The sky was gray. The wind was thin and cold, like a blanket of sadness spread over the entire town. The high school courtyard was packed. Students, teachers, parents, even strangers who had never known Asa Whitmore. Beneath a large white canopy stood his photo, a simple frame. His eyes tilted sideways, gazing at something unseen. It wasn't a polished portrait. It was blurry, snapped in passing. Behind him, an old bus stop and a crooked scarf. But it was Asa, unfiltered, untidy, real. The principal spoke first. His voice trembled. "We lost a student, whom we should have seen much earlier." He didn't meet anyone's eyes when he said it. Next came the mayor, a man who had passed Asa in the park 3 times and never once shook his hand. He said words like role model bravery, our town's pride. But the wind caught the microphone, ripping his words apart until nothing stuck. Then came a girl from school, the one who had laughed when Asa was shoved into a dumpster. She cried. No one knew if it was for Asa or the shame crushing her chest. Then Asa's mother stepped forward. She held no paper, carried nothing but dry eyes after a week without sleep. She stood in the middle of the courtyard, voice steady, but low. "My son wasn't a hero. He couldn't write good essays or run fast. He didn't have any A's, but he said good morning to everyone. He remembered your birthdays. He gave cookies to an old bus driver. And he stopped when someone needed help. She looked up, scanning every face in the crowd. He was just a child who knew how to care. In a world that never cared back. No one said a word after that, only the wind. At the very back row, Silas sat motionless. He wore Asa's old sweater, the collar still carrying the scent of sweat and cheap laundry soap. He didn't speak, he didn't stand. But the tears, they didn't stop. No one could really see them because Silas kept his head down. In his pocket, his fingers clutched the small handkerchief, the only thing in this world he both wanted to hold forever, and throw away because it hurt too much. When the ceremony ended, people stepped forward, laying flowers beneath the photo. They whispered, "I'm sorry, thank you. Rest easy." Silas left nothing behind. He simply stood and walked away, down the path behind the school, the one he and Asa used to take home in silence. The wind tousled his hair and he let it. And he thought if Asa left anything behind, it wasn't grief. It was a question. Why did a child have to die? For people to finally see him. The funeral was held on a Sunday morning mid-January, with snow blanketing the low grave markers beyond the trees. The earth was still soft, damp, underfoot, sinking slightly with every step. A white tent had been set up to shield against the rain, but the wind still slipped in through every flap, cutting to the bone. Asa was laid to rest in a simple pine coffin, dark-stained, unadorned. No ornate carvings, no need. He never liked anything fancy. More than 300 people came. Children, teachers, neighbors, old classmates. Some wore formal black. Some wore scarves printed with Asa's face, like he'd become a martyr. But all Silas saw was this: many of them were the same ones who once looked away. The woman who once yelled at Asa for stepping on her lawn. The boy who shoved him into the chalkboard during biology. The principal who dismissed a bullying video as just kids being kids. Now all of them bowing their heads, tears gathering in their eyes. As the priest finished the final blessing, Silas couldn't hold it in anymore. He shot up from his seat, his voice cutting through the wind. "Who exactly are you crying for?" Heads turned. His mother flinched. Some shrank as if they'd just been named. Silas stepped forward, pointing directly into the crowd. Why now? Where were you when he was alive? Who shoved him into walls and laughed? Who called him retard? To his face. Who pretended not to see when he sat alone in the freezing cold? Some looked down. A few turned and walked away. Most stayed silent, unable to speak, unwilling to deny. Silas's voice cracked, his eyes now bloodshot with rage and grief. His hand gripped the handkerchief in his pocket, creased, frayed, worn thin since the day Asa left. He didn't need your tears. He needed a place, a name spoken with respect, a decent hug, a simple good morning. He stepped closer to the coffin, as if shielding his brother one last time from all the eyes that now suddenly cared. Don't use his death to feel better about yourselves. Don't build a statue if you once turned your back. Silas clenched his jaw, ready to say more, until a hand rested gently on his shoulder. His mother. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, tired but unbroken. Then she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "Enough, son. He doesn't need their grief. He needs you to live. For the both of you." Silas turned, lips pressed tight, his grip loosened. He nodded slowly, and as the others came forward, dropping flowers into the grave, Silas placed just one thing inside. A handkerchief frayed at the edges, nearly torn, stitched in crooked letters. "You are my home." The wind still blew, but this time it didn't feel cold anymore. A week after the funeral, Silas stepped into Asa's room for the first time since his brother was gone. The room was the same, the small bed tucked against the window, the blanket folded unevenly, a flashlight on the desk, Asa's favorite for studying bus maps at night. The walls were still covered large sheets of paper, hand-drawn maps and smudged colored pencil roots, twisting and turning with strange little symbols only Asa understood. But this time, Silas didn't look at the maps. He opened the desk drawer. Inside were dozens of folded sheets, some creased in quarters, some wrinkled, a few stained with cookie crumbs. He picked them up gently, as if they might fall apart in his hands. Each was a map, but not just bus routes. There were notes, scrawled messages in crooked letters, Not lined neatly, but clear enough. Silas likes orange juice. Mom is sad when there's no dinner. I will learn to make eggs. If the bus is late, I'll walk the kids home. Joy forgets her jacket. I'll remind her. Silas read every line, his eyes stinging. These weren't just maps. They were Asa's blueprint for living a quiet world, where he tried to make sure no one got lost, no one stayed cold, no one went hungry. In the last drawer, Silas found one final sheet, folded in half, a drawing in the center, a small house, 3 people standing out front, a mother, a brother, and a boy with a red scarf around his neck. Below it, Asa had written, "I don't need to be good. I just want to stay." Silas folded the paper, slowly, held it to his chest, and for the first time in days, he smiled. A smile full of tears, but no longer choking, because Asa didn't leave behind emptiness. He left a map on how to be kind in a world that never learned. How? 1 year later, the schoolyard that once haunted Asa had become the place where his name would live on forever. A small memorial stood beside the old bus stop where Asa used to wait every morning, etched deeply into a gray stone slab. Asa Whitmore, you were never lost. You showed us the way. Wildflowers surrounded it, placed there weekly by students. Each first grader that year was given a round pin, white background, blue letters. Kind is enough. It wasn't a slogan. It was a lesson. Silas stood in front of a special education classroom on a quiet autumn morning. A small room, sunlight filtering through a dusty window. On the board, he had written just one word: welcome. It was his first day teaching, his first time standing in front of a class as the new inclusion teacher. He took a breath, looked at the young, wide-eyed faces, some nervous, some curious, and began. You know, I had a little brother. He wasn't good at math. He didn't talk much. But my brother taught me how to love. He paused. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. He didn't need to be good to be loved. He loved others by quietly drawing maps, with gentle eyes, and by giving his life so others could live. The room went still, and then a small boy in the front row raised his hand. Teacher. What was his name? Silas smiled. Asa. His name was Asa.